Excellent. Welcome, Mr. Scott Draw. Just give us a quick overview of some of your vast professional experience so people understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, and probably like all good performance organizations, I'll start at the end. So currently, or any good performance planning, currently I'm director of sport at a place called Millfield School. It's UK's one of the leading environments for youth development, particularly through sport. So this is my fourth year. I came to here after a number of years working in professional cycling. So that was with Team Sky and Team Ineos, and working across science, medicine, and innovation. And then prior to that, with England Rugby in player development. And that's probably really where I got a passion for youth and talent. All the time in very sort of technical type roles, working with, managing specialists across the science, medicine, technology, engineering fields. But the vast majority of my career has been spent in Olympic sport with Team GB UK Sport. I headed up a research innovation program, which fundamentally operated across all of our best British sports as we head into London, and across not just London. I think there were 6 Summer and Winter Olympic Games, which I supported, problem solving through science, medicine, and tech. And that was from the early 2000s just to London and beyond. So that's really where I got an insight and understanding about that space. I got to work with some really cool people from aerospace, F1, military, just solving problems and trying to help us win medals. And it covered everything from bespoke equipment development, so think bikes, helmets, race suits, garments, everything from aero engineering through to measurement technologies, what we call coaching tech. And actually, for many people that be familiar with devices like Catapult, that was the early stages of the development of all of those devices, from analysis and just general tracking. So everything from hardware, unique software design, using that software to inform decision making with both athletes and coaches. And then lots of work in training science, so how you use all that to inform the training process, particularly talent development, through to work around athlete health. So real breadth and depth of experiences, but scientist at heart, really. And that's the premise by which I look at things in a very logical lens, but in a very practical sense of like working with now coaches. Particularly I manage a big group of coaches now who run full-time programs for young people who have motivations and aspirations to achieve their best through sport.
Amazing. Well, Scott, you've got everyone I know licked for experience there. So I'll try and draw some of it out. We went across a number of themes when we got together. How we were going to focus on individualization of data specifically here. So maybe if you wouldn't start, like, why is this something that you feel is relevant and interesting to either what you're currently doing or where you've come from?
I guess there are numerous perspectives to this. I think what we've probably seen in the past decade and above and beyond that is certainly significant commercialization, if I call it that, of field-based technologies. So, what we've always wanted to do in a lab to now what we do day in, day out around measuring things on people to understand how they're developing. So that process, that feedback loop and that process, as I say, has been driven by commercial means. But I guess what I'm curious about is the application of that to make people better at what they do. And I think that's where the big opportunity still is. The technology is improved. We can measure lots of things, whether we measure anything that's relevant or not, or really understand the premise around it. But I still think the unique opportunity is how we use that to inform change, but also to help people achieve their best, whether that's whatever level or ability that is, and whether that's through sport or not. And I still think that's unexploited opportunity. I still think that's an area that everything falls down because we end up being too siloed. We don't understand the complexity of development. So I'm really intrigued in that space around coaching, learning, teaching, development, and it was particularly brought to life with my current role, really.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of just covered probably an entire podcast in one answer there. But let's try and dig into one of those. So we're talking about individualization of data. What do you think are like the key principles of when that's done really well for athletes?
Number one, absolutely for me, is an emotional connection to the individual. So there's like in the delivery of any science or any numbers, whichever sort of science or application you do, you need to find a connection with your individual you are, because you're ultimately trying to create change in the actions and behaviors long term. So I'll tell a story. I recall the story in the early 2000s when I was involved in Olympic sport, and it was the early days of aerodynamic testing. So we're doing some work with British Cycling, and we were doing some testing in a wind tunnel with some cyclists. And we had a number of the Olympic cyclists come down into a wind tunnel to test and decide which helmet was right going into a world championship. I think it was 05, 06, if I can recall. So those athletes came into the tunnel, they tested them, and we learned about what the best helmet was. We took that information, then went back into the program, and they shared that with lots of other athletes to say, right, on the basis of this, when we get them to track, this is the best helmet choice. When we got to that major games, the only ones who actually wore the right helmet in terms of aerodynamic performance of those that came into the tunnel. So the fact they'd engaged in the process, been able to see the numbers, and were able to translate those numbers to time on task, what it may mean in terms of how fast you go, it meant something to them. In some ways, they trusted what you're doing. The numbers were theirs. They were related to their particular setup, their involvement, their engagement, their performance. They sort of emotionally connected to it. And that, in those early stages of being involved as a young practitioner, really highlighted that for me around, it was so unique and individual for them and their unique circumstances. But because they could see it, they could believe it, and we could translate it into something that was meaningful for them. And for them, it was a time of doing a lap, for example. They made the change. So, and I think that process was compelling in itself. You couldn't just take generic information and share and say, this is what the science says, do X and Y, because that doesn't create change. So it's no different to working with coaches in some sense. It had to be meaningful and believable and trustworthy to their unique circumstances. And I think that story for me brought it home at that moment in time around why it's really important to individualize around that individual. We use the word buy-in, but it's a trust and belief that that's going to make me better. And in a sport like cycling, where it is very measurable and very visible, and you can translate it to a time, it's a sport that's centimeters, gram, speed sort of related. It's really obvious. I think it's a bit more complex in more complex sports, invasion sports and things like that, with lots of decision making and things going on. But I think the ability to translate it to a direct outcome, which would make a difference, was compelling enough. And I think that's where my own journey started, in that process of understanding about change, particularly with athletes, regardless of age or ability or sport.
Yeah, so why do you think some sports are more compelled or open to engage with our players in this performance realm, whereas others, whether it be through tradition or complexity, are a little slower to move into this area?
Yeah, good question. Why would some be slower to move into that? I guess a lot will come back to your fundamental belief in that process and your ability to influence change, I think. But I think there's lots of things in it, but I think equally the emergence of much technology is not, I'm going to use the word trustworthy. So I think if you have real belief in the methods and approaches you're using, and therefore your ability to convey that to others, I think that can help get people on the journey. But I think often it's been the tail wagging the dog, if that makes sense. The tech has been driving the process rather than high quality questions that can make a difference to that individual. And I think so we've often chased the technology and therefore not been able to create a compelling story that will want somebody to connect to what you're trying to do or the way you're trying to help them. So there's lots of things, but I think those people that have got a rigorous approach to it would be a lot more cautious around understanding what that may mean to that individual. And I think we've probably, science in general, or sports science in general, is probably ran too quickly in many circumstances. And therefore, I think we've done things that are not really that truthful. And they don't mean anything to the individual. And therefore, they've lost trust, if that makes sense. So there's lots of reasons why probably that's the case. But I think in many cases, we've tried to run before we could walk. And I think being cautious and understanding around this versus that balance of trying to deliver some sort of impact hasn't been necessarily right. I think there's been a desire to do stuff just because we could. And that's meant anything that we've done hasn't had a desired impact.
So Scott, for sports or individuals that are interested in, moving into this space, then, athlete engagement is something that conceptually is interesting, but they don't have much previous experience to. What kind of guidance would you give to that initial engagement or initial education experience you want to take the athlete on to create that kind of co-working environment?
I think it's really important that you can give line of sight towards an outcome that's meaningful to the way they compete and play on game day. So start at the end of that journey. So what is it in my performance that's gonna really make a difference to me and to the contribution of that team? And that may well be, you know, making that additional run, being able to run a bit faster, whatever those things are. I think there needs to be a bit of dialogue before you throw the tech at it around things that are meaningful to that individual. Ultimately, what's the plan? What do they believe is going to make a real difference to the way they compete and play on game day? And try to understand it from their perspective. So I think by getting that right, and that comes through good dialogue and trust and understanding, then apply the tech to help them answer that question. Does that make sense? So I think we often do it the other way around. So I think really working closely with the individual to understand from their perspective what things are going to make a difference, also the experience of the coaches around them, and therefore give line of sight. So therefore, when they put in all the work and all the effort, and you know, and it hurts to improve, they see that, and therefore they trust the process that they've been through. So a lot is about that process and protocol. But you know, I would engage with that individual and understand what's really important for them, what's going to make a difference to them on game day, and then apply that process to them. So the work they put in, you're able to illustrate the difference. They'll then have confidence in the numbers, because if you can connect that subjective feel, yeah, I've been able to make those extra runs, I'm seeing it and I've been able to go, or I've made that recovery run in a football sense, I've been able to make that. Like, there'll be moments, those critical moments that they can articulate and tell stories about. And you'll be able to demonstrate the process you've been through made that difference. Does that make sense? So absolutely, that would be my recommendation to anybody, I think, in that sense. Really start at the end, really understand from that individual's perspective what they think is going to make a difference. Of course, there's various views and opinions on there, and then tailor everything you do around it. So therefore, you have absolute confidence in the process. And when they've done the work and they've shown they've been able to improve, and that could be in a game, it could be a long-term period, but I think you're able to demonstrate that, and that would give belief and trust in the processes that you're trying to deliver.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So let's kind of skip ahead to a point where, you know, you've got your athlete or your player engaged. They're kind of bought into this process. They've got a feedback loop going on with their data. What's your perspective on the need to either maintain the process, offer variability? How do you keep them engaged in that learning cycle for ultimately their whole career, but as long as possible as a minimum?
Yeah, I would always refer back to a framework that I called on based on principles of andragogy. So andragogy is about adult learning, pedagogy is child learning. There's a guy called Malcolm Knowles who spoke about the art and science of adult learning, but he created these principles. Now, you can argue whether they're right or not, but actually, I think I connect with them as an individual based on practice. And I like these principles, which I refer to all the point, and I share with the audience around it. Number one was really getting to the point of helping people understand why they need to learn something. So if you get that right, you know, in terms of, and that could be through that example of that engagement I just had. The second one is that I think adults, and it may be young adults in the sense of particularly some sports, tend to learn more experientially, feel-based. So learning and recognizing that, I think you can engage in the real world to do it. It's not it's a real life experiment. The third principle is, I think young adults and adults like to learn through problem solving. So using that as a principle to work to. The fourth is that you're able to do something that has of immediate value. So I think that's where the advent and growth of technology and be able to get real-time feedback now is important, because you're able to show difference immediately. So if you're intervening and making recommendations for change and you see that, I think that could be quite powerful. The fourth is, I think those individuals will engage in that process when they're intrinsically motivated as opposed to externally. So that's why you need to have really good dialogue with the individual and learn to understand what matters to them. Because if you can connect to that internal reason, which this is going to make me better at what I do, when I'm more likely to be successful, something that as opposed to extrinsic, that would be one of the frameworks. And the last principle that I sort of would work around is where adults therefore feel responsible for their own learning. So when you get to a point where they're beginning to drive that, and the example I gave you was trying to do that early on, I think they'll have a lot more ownership for it. So those are the sort of principles that I'd work to around that idea of andragogy, which is about why do they need to learn something? Young adults and adults love to learn experientially, so really do it in the moment. Take a problem-solving approach, try to give something back that has immediate value, really try to understand what that intrinsic motivation is and what's driving them to do that, and where they have more responsibility for their learning, and always try to frame it around those principles. And I think therefore all the data you connect, if it's connected to that principle, I think you're not going to go that far wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic framework to hang a load of like good common sense structure around. So really like that. I suppose the last question I've got is really around more of a modern principle, around social media, but not exclusively social media. And it's, with data, players have got an ability to craft their own narrative with access to their own data. What's your perspective on players using performance data for these non-performance kind of focuses? What's the validity of them being able to express themselves outside of just the performance domain? Is that something that we should support and develop? Is that something that is potentially dangerous? Like it's a completely new area, so I'd love to get your perspective on it.
I think there is an opportunity here, because I think if we're genuinely here to support the individual and we've got that athlete-centered approach, we need to help them tell their story, and to help individuals tell their story, and that may help them monetize in that sense, that may help them develop as an individual, which is the driver. I think we could use that information in that way, because I think that may articulate about their beliefs, what they do, how they prepare, how they function, and create an image about what they truly are. And so I think it's first and foremost, it's fundamental to their development. And I think we can use this in many other ways. That's not just about the development process, but helping them articulate about their beliefs, their values, what they believe in, to have a much bigger impact. I guess one of my inspirations, I know you're familiar with John Amici. He's got some very well articulated arguments about, athletes have this opportunity. They've been put into this domain where they can have a much bigger impact on other people and on society. And I think we may be able to use this information to help them do that, if that makes sense. Sometimes it's really difficult depending on your background, but I think with the right support around them, we can use all this performance data to help them tell a story that connect people to sport, give them a better reason to want to follow it. And in some respect, help that athlete give something bigger back. And I think if you can do that with a much bigger purpose, then you're in a really special place. In some ways, people try to do that through marketing, don't they, in PR and publicity. But I think by using real truthful information that's about them and their development and their journey, I think that can have real appeal. We're sort of seeing it currently at the moment. I think it's being done well, not necessarily through performance data, but the stories around, the Women's Euros 2022 here at the moment. I think real positive stories around the growth of football in the female space, and like that creates role models, that gets more people engaged in us. So I think there's a bigger purpose of how we can use this to genuinely have value through sport on society. And I think if you get to that point, that's going to be phenomenal.
Yeah, Scott, it's a fantastic place to end, because I think the power of the narratives that athletes can shape for their own performance development, but for the wider good as well, is feels like a fitting place to round off a really, really helpful and insightful look at individualization of data. Scott, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it as ever. Look forward to catching up again soon.
Great, enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.